Let me start with this tax proposal. We've heard a lot from Republican members of Congress and from the administration itself signaling the importance of this moment, that we've gone from 1 page to 2 pages to 9 pages now. We have a framework for tax reform, or at least how they'd like to proceed with it. What's your reaction to what you've seen of that so far?
Well, good to be with you, David. It is just a framework, so one has to be a little cautious because a lot of the details aren't there. But from what I've seen, there's some pretty dangerous ideas that are out there. The kind of fantasy that you can do $5 to $6 trillion of tax cuts and have them pay for themselves is just that. It's fantasy. And fantasy may be good for fiction, but it isn't good for fiscal policy. We've tried this experiment before. We tried it in 1981. We tried it in 2001. We tried it in 2003. It didn't work, and the deficit exploded each time. Just this last couple of years, it was tried in Kansas, and a Republican state repealed its tax cut because it wasn't working. I think that if the Congress puts kind of hope and fantasy over experience, it's going to unleash some very dangerous forces, and a deficit that spirals out of control becomes a threat to everything from vulnerable elderly people on Social Security to our national defense. So I think that the first and foremost thing is it has to be done with honest numbers. It has to be done in a realistic way, and we can't turn around and find out that we've destroyed our fiscal condition.
Let me ask you about one component part of it in particular, that with pass-through entities. There's a provision in the framework that says there's going to be a preventative measure that keeps salary earners from abusing that. What do you make of that, and how do you prevent that from happening? What does that mean for the IRS, for instance, and how they would have to enforce that?
I think the pass-through proposal is a very dangerous one. The idea that you can police it is something that I don't think anyone knows how to deliver on, knows how to execute. It is very easy to reorganize on paper as a partnership or as an entity that can take advantage of pass-through rules. And if the rate for pass-throughs is 25%, and if the rate as an individual is 35%, I guarantee you that anyone who can will reorganize. They just did in the Kansas experiment. They created a pass-through rate, and they had an enormous increase in pass-through filers. The coach of the university football team reorganized as a pass-through. It's really hard to police. I think it becomes something that could become an enormously expensive provision, the kind of loophole that years from now people say, how did you ever create that? And it will contribute to the inequity and unfairness of the tax system because it will just deliver a tax break to the most fortunate.
What's your reaction to so much being done, or the attempt to get so much done through reconciliation? You have a background on the Hill, you were at OMB, you were in the Treasury Department, you were in the White House. What are the problems associated with that as you see them?
Look, reconciliation is a mechanism that permits Congress to do by a majority vote what would otherwise take a supermajority to do otherwise in the Senate. If you're building a consensus to do responsible policy, it can be a very important and useful tool. I think what we've seen in recent weeks on the health care bill was an attempt to use the reconciliation device to have policies that nobody understood that had enormous impact on the well-being of American people kind of come through on an express train in a dangerous way. The good news is that on the health care debate, facts actually mattered. When it turned out that underneath the hood, what you were doing was, cutting taxes for people with a lot of capital gains and cutting health benefits for people who were getting health care through the Affordable Care Act or Medicaid, they couldn't get the votes, even with a simple majority. So a simple majority doesn't guarantee you, smooth sailing. It makes it easier and it makes it faster. I think whether you're doing it by 51 votes or 60 votes, you have to make policy based on fact. You have to make sure that you understand what the consequences of what you're doing is. And if you do that in the context of reconciliation, it's one thing. If you don't, it's another. In healthcare, happily, so far it hasn't worked. But it's taken some pretty fast footwork to make sure the facts got out there before the votes were over.
You stood on the edge of the fiscal cliff time and time again, and you were holding your fist to the heavens, saying something needed to change when it comes to the debt ceiling. We had a three-month extension a couple of weeks back. The Treasury Department, the administration is going to be facing this in a few months' time. Is this a fixable thing? Why is it so hard to convey to Congress, to the American people, the importance of raising the debt ceiling?
I think that I have made the case many times that Congress has no choice but to pass the debt limit because all of the decisions to spend money have been made. And by the time the debt limit comes up, all you're deciding is whether or not to pay the bills. And the United States has to stand by the full faith and credit of the United States. Now, that doesn't mean it isn't a moment where you can gain leverage. And it was used for many years as a way to kind of use a deadline to force a discussion of a difficult topic. Something changed in the last few years. When we were seeing congressmen and senators calling for default if they didn't get their way, and actually seeming to think that default might be better than working out the differences, it kind of went from being an unpleasant form of leverage to being a form of extortion that just had to be stopped. That's why in 2013 we said we're not even going to negotiate. You just have to raise the debt limit. Now, I think it's a good thing that the debt limit was and government funding was handled in a bipartisan way to kick it out. But let's not get overexcited about the content of that bipartisan agreement. All it did was kick the can down the road, and depending on which estimates you see, it'll either all come due in December or some in December and some in the spring. I don't see any process underway that leads me to be particularly confident that there's a bipartisan spirit that's going to make this easy when those dates come around.
Was your confidence further eroded by the apparent disconnect there was between the Treasury Secretary and the White House in the days, hours leading up to this announcement that we had this bipartisan deal? Your successor was talking about going for an 18-month deal, and then you got a 3-month deal from the White House.
I always thought it was very important that the Treasury Secretary and the Treasury Department speak with authority on the debt limit. I think that to the extent that there's any question about that, it makes managing what can be a very anxious time very difficult. So I certainly hope that they kind of get their ducks in a row so that if we approach another deadline, there's the ability to speak with authority and calm what could otherwise be nervous markets. We've seen in all the approaching deadlines that rates start to reflect the anxiety, that liquidity starts to reflect the anxiety. You have to start managing the technical kind of instruments of what you're offering around the deadline's constraints, and it starts to cost you money and distort the markets. If you couldn't speak with authority and calm things down, that would only be more so.
Let me ask you about the strong dollar policy, a facet of the U.S. government for a very long while now. Is it your sense that Secretary Mnuchin is continuing with that? Is it being watered down at all, do you think?
Look, I think that what's going on now is that you're seeing global economic conditions change. During the years when I was asked about the strong dollar, the United States was performing, relatively speaking, much better than Europe and relatively speaking, much better than Japan. You now see growth rates of 2-ish% in many of these places, and you hear talk even today of rate movement maybe sooner not later, say in the UK, Europe I think probably a little behind. As the growth rates in the different economies equilibrate, you're going to see movement of the exchanges. That's what exchange rates do. They adjust. So my own view of what's going on right now is largely that global economics are changing. I think the kind of uncertainty about policy in the United States, has some impact. I mean, at the beginning of the year, there were unrealistic hopes about a combination of tax cuts and infrastructure and massive deregulation. I don't know where those hopes are now. I certainly don't see a lot of movement since January in any of these areas. We've seen this week, a plan put on the table. We've also seen a lot of yellow lights that the plan may not have a smooth path. The concerns that I've raised, are, I think, going to start to be discussed more and more as we see more details of the plan. And I haven't heard talk of infrastructure in a very long time. So a lot of that talk was suggesting that there'd be more activity in the economy, and that led to strengthening of the dollar. Then you saw the economies around the world start to strengthen. I'm not going to comment on what the policy of the administration is because I actually think the dollar movement reflects these conditions.
Let's move from currencies to cryptocurrencies, and Bitcoin has certainly been in the news here over these last few weeks. Jamie Dimon analogizing it to the Dutch tulip crisis of centuries past. Do you sympathize with what he's saying? Is it something that you had to reckon with or deal with when you were in the Treasury Department, and are you worried about the integrity of it as a mechanism?
Yeah, David, I actually spent a fair amount of time thinking about these virtual currencies and try to keep my mind open to innovation and change. You think about innovation in the financial sector, it comes through things that happen in a kind of disruptive way. That's how you get checking accounts. It's how you get credit cards. So I'm reluctant to say, oh, new things are bad. I had some special concerns about virtual currencies, partially because of the secrecy factor. We worry about large cash transactions because large cash transactions can be used for bad purposes. You create something that makes it easy to do that, and it has those same characteristics. We decided to treat the virtual currencies like currencies for the purpose of trying to keep track of them, but it's hard. I also worried about it being used as a means of storing value because when I made comparisons to tulip prices, I was urged not to do so publicly as Treasury Secretary, but it did cross my mind to say that at the time. I mean, I personally wouldn't store my kind of savings in something that unpredictable, and I don't know how many unsophisticated investors are doing that. I think one of the things you've seen with these currencies, because of their anonymity and ease of movement, is that in a country like China, where people want to get their money out of the country, it's become an easy mechanism to do so. I think that's why you're seeing China now clamp down a little bit on things like Bitcoin. I mean, I kind of end on this where I started, which is the technology behind Bitcoin, blockchain, is now being appropriated by the mainstream financial sector to cause the kind of improvements in processing and improvements in safety that are going to be really good. That's not the same as should you store your wealth in Bitcoin. I think you have to separate out the technology question from the application.
The Fed parlor game is underway. You've lived through this a few times before. The Journal reporting this morning that Kevin Warsh was at the White House meeting with the President and the Treasury Secretary. Do you know Mr. Warsh? Have you interacted with him?
Our paths have crossed, but my main interactions were with the chairs and the vice chairs and the officials responsible for financial regulation. So I didn't deal with him very, very closely.
I bring it up because the Treasury Secretary was at the meeting, and I wonder what role the Secretary plays in advising the President. You were certainly there when Janet Yellen was.
I was there when Janet Yellen was appointed, and I can tell you what happened when I was there. I had the meeting with all of the candidates before they met with the President, and was, as Chief of Staff, advising him. I was about to be Treasury Secretary. Tim was in the conversation, Tim Geithner. And it's a pretty small circle. Usually the head of the NEC, the Treasury Secretary, the Chief of Staff. That's kind of the circle that, in my experience, talks to the President about that kind of an appointment. Ultimately, it's an appointment that is of unique importance. I mean, arguably the chairman of the Fed is, it's in that list of the very most important economic positions in the world. I think in my experience, we've had extraordinary individuals chair the Fed who've done so with integrity and intellect. You don't always agree with them, but I've never had concerns about their capacity and their dedication and integrity.
Does background matter? Does it matter if you have an academician or you have somebody from the business world?
So, the one thing that, have you ever been in the Fed building?
I have.
Yeah. It's pretty quiet in the Fed building. It's kind of like a university without students. You can hear a pin drop in a lot of the hallways. So as a matter of personal style, I have talked to people as they've thought about going to the Fed who've wondered, is it an environment they would enjoy spending their days in? People talk about pretty technical things all the time, and you're not involved in the day-to-day, transactional business on many days. I mean, you have the meetings, you have international meetings, and then you kind of retreat into this appropriately kind of academic environment. So when I hear about individuals from the business world, I mean, I have always suggested you ought to make sure it's a place you want to go work.
Very good. You and I have traveled together. I had the fortune of traveling with you on a government plane, I'll point out, to Beijing. to Mexico City as well. Help me understand what's going on here. When a cabinet secretary would need to rely on private aviation or chartered aviation versus a government plane. Just broadly speaking, what are the rules surrounding cabinet secretaries?
I must say that I don't have any experience with chartered planes for government officials, so I don't know. I don't know from experience. Government planes are provided when the mission requires it, and I use them for international travel and domestic travel that was attended. I'd often, on my way, give a speech, on my way to Asia, give a speech on the West Coast, or stop somewhere on the East Coast on the way back. But I never used military aircraft for domestic travel. The purpose of it is to provide security and communications, and to bring a fairly substantial team in a cost-effective way. If you have to put everyone on a commercial plane, that's not free either. I have had no experience of the use of private charters for cabinet secretaries. It was kind of new to me when I read about it this week.
I want to come back and talk to you about Europe and China in just a moment, but first let me ask you about a piece that was first reported by the Wall Street Journal. A Treasury working paper was taken down from the website that came to a conclusion counter to, I suppose, what this Treasury Secretary believes when it comes to tax policy. How worried does that make you about the integrity of nonpartisan research in an institution like the Treasury Department or in government broadly?
So I don't know the facts behind it, and I don't want to kind of cast a judgment on something that I'm not familiar with. I thought that one of the real strengths of the Treasury Department was that we had a career staff that was respected not just domestically but around the world for their expertise and their independence. Anyone who has tried to tell the Office of Tax Policy what to think, has been frustrated. They're professionals who only do what is analytically defensible. In my experience. Yeah. When I was outside of Treasury and other agencies as either OMB director or White House chief of staff, I would sometimes find it frustrating because I wanted to, it was kind of like arguing with the Congressional Budget Office. You were arguing to yourself. Sure. Now, when you're at Treasury, you realize that it's kind of the coin of the currency, and that is the intellectual strength of the department. And one of the interesting things about the Treasury Department is you spend a lot of time doing things that are not in your formal charter. Treasury is seen as, I think appropriately, a place of expertise and of intellectual rigor and honesty. It is hard to earn a reputation like that, and it's easy to lose it.
You did so much with regard to sanctions. You used it as a major policy tool when you were in office. I'm sure you've been watching as this administration has applied them to North Korea in particular. Is there more the administration can do? They've been weighing a lot, they've been implementing a lot, they've been working in concert with the UN. Is there more that they can do toward North Korea?
Look, first thing, the DPRK's development of a nuclear weapon and an intercontinental ballistic missile system is an enormous threat to the United States and to the whole world. If sanctions are going to be effective to change their behavior, it is going to have to really cut down the regime's access to resources to pay their army and the immediate sustaining center of his regime. That means you have to shut it down completely. The avenue to do that has to go through China, because North Korea's only connection financially to the world or supply lines that get them the fuel they need, the food they need, come from China. We've worked with China for years, and we were it was important that we were able last year during the Obama administration to work together at the UN to put tougher sanctions in place. I think it was a very good thing that the current administration was able to get tougher sanctions again. I think that as you ratchet up sanctions, which I believe you should, you have to do it in a careful, thoughtful, analytic way. The way we did with Russia. We were very attentive when we put the Russia sanctions in place to potential unintended consequences. We did not want to cause a recession in Europe or a global recession. We did want to put pressure on Putin in the immediate circle. I think this is a case where it's particularly hard because it goes through China, and in the end, we need China to be cooperating with us, and we don't want to turn a North Korea problem into a U.S.-China problem.
And also the problem is that North Korea is such a unique economy, right? How do you ensure the efficacy of sanctions when the black market takes such a big chunk of that economy?
Well, I think that the reality is without fuel, even a black market economy would have more problems. Without access to international transactions, North Korea is not a country that produces very much. It has to have some external connection. I think that the need for a diplomatic approach here with China is very important. I assume this will be the top of the agenda when Secretary Tillerson goes to China. I think you have to be really firm with China, but you also have to be clear, understandable, and sharing what your thoughts are and what you're going to do, and not have it kind of break so that there's kind of random things happening so that they don't know what to expect or how to make decisions. I think that this has been a confusing period, and I would caution against using kind of excessive language that you can't deliver on, because on the other side, that makes it very hard to even know how to respond. I'll just say one other thing. I don't think it's helpful that in the background there's this discussion about the Iran sanctions. In the case of the Iran sanctions, we had a negotiation which led to Iran pulling back from their nuclear program and getting sanctions relief. There's no evidence that they're in violation of the nuclear agreement. The agreement did not pull them back from a lot of other bad behavior. If the sanctions are reimposed while they're honoring the agreement, it will undermine confidence that the U.S. keeps its word. And sanctions only work if sovereign countries change their policy to get sanctions relief. So the whole tool of sanctions is a very delicate one, and sometimes being tough makes you weaker if you don't do it in a smart way.
Very quickly, here, just about a minute left. I want to ask you about Puerto Rico. You traveled there when you were secretary and were concerned about the fiscal situation. I can only imagine what we've just seen with the hurricane compounds that even more. How much more worried are you about that part of the U.S. now going forward?
The men, women, and children of Puerto Rico are American citizens, and our hearts go out to them, and we have to have more than our hearts going out to them. They need our help now. They need to get power back into their schools and hospitals. They need food and water. But underneath that is a financial problem and an infrastructure problem that has to be fixed. I hope that coming out of this is a coming together to support Puerto Rico. We had a bipartisan agreement last year that showed that you could actually do things together on Puerto Rico. People should stand behind that, and people should try to do more.